Hello, this is David with 3 Orcs. I figured I'd make a video about skill systems of Dungeons & Dragons from the very beginning all the way to 5th edition. You know, with players playing a lot of different versions of D&D these days, it gets a little confusing of the different various skill systems of D&D throughout the years. You know, some players are playing different campaigns at the same time in different games, different versions in the same week. And often it'll get a little confusing between the two, and I figured this chart that I created will help rectify that confusion and maybe give you a little history of where the skill system came from and how it grew over the years and became what it is today. And of course, every Dungeon Master has to wear their t-shirt at every table, and I always do, and I always encourage my players to do that as well. You really need to understand the skill system so you can really run the game well, and so that your players can really have a fun time, so you can set the pace and timing to make a fun game. If you let the skill system get in the way, then that will cause the game to slow down, and it'll be no fun for anybody. So understanding the skill system is a good way to go. And to help you understand the skill system, maybe it'll be useful if you understood the history of where skills came from and why they were invented in the first place. D&D had a huge impact on my life. I started playing in grade school after Star Wars came out in 1977, where I started a gaming club that led to D&D. At the time, I would be found in the classroom, keeping my head low, buried in a fantasy book. The D&D Blue Box set changed and consumed my life. Quickly after that, I bought the AD&D Player's Handbook by Gary Gygax, which had a massive influence on me. I highly recommend these books to read. Rise of the Dungeon Master, Gary Gygax and the Creation of D&D by David Kushner and Corinne Sadmi. This graphic novel is a quick read, and it is a brief glimpse into the life of Gary Gygax, the creation of D&D, the controversy, and the effects that the game had on pop culture and many lives that it touched. The next book is Empire of Imagination, Gary Gygax and the Birth of Dungeons & Dragons by Michael Whitwer. I found that this biography is a series of fictional vignettes about events in Gary Gygax's life, loosely connected by nods at context, which is more of a inspired by true events story than an actual biography. And the last one is Of Dice and Men, the story of Dungeons & Dragons and the people who play it by David Ewalt. This was a fun read about the history of Dungeons & Dragons. The author injects that some scenes from one of his own D&D campaign, which I liked, but sometimes it strayed a little bit too far from the subject and covered a lot other role-playing games. I was really happy to identify with a lot of the scenes in this book, and not just from playing the game. You can find my affiliate links down below. I created a chart to sort that all out. But first, let's go ahead and review the versions of D&D that we're talking about here. Several different editions of Dungeons & Dragons, D&D, has been produced since 1974. The current publisher of D&D, Wizards of the Coast, produces new materials only for the most current edition of the game. However, many D&D fans continue to play older versions of the game, and many amazing third-party companies continue to publish materials compatible with these older editions. So let's go ahead and take a look at all of the editions, or most of them, and how they treated skill checks starting from the very beginning. First, we have Zero D&D, OD&D, from 1974. The original game had only 3 classes: Cleric, Fighter, Magic User. Cleric spells up to 5th level, Magic User spells up to 6th level. After the original edition of D&D was introduced in 1974, the game was split into 2 branches in 1977. The Rules Light system of Dungeons & Dragons called the Holmes Edition, and the more complex rules-heavy system of Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, AD&D, was known to be called Dungeons & Dragons Basic, was eventually expanded into a series of 5 box sets by the mid-80s, before being compiled and slightly revised in 1991 as the Dungeons & Dragons Rules Cyclopedia. Meanwhile, the second edition of AD&D was published in 1989. In the year 2000, the 2 versions of AD&D ended when a new version was designated the 3rd edition, but dropped the advanced prefix to be called simply Dungeons & Dragons. The 4th edition was published in 2008, and the 5th edition was released in 2014. As you can see from the chart here on the screen, I laid out the different versions in chronological order, and I also have side paths. They split from that base edition. For example, you'll see Beckme drifting off more towards the top of the chart to keep them together. Starting with the 1977 box set Basic D&D, Beckme was compiled by France Mencher and published from 1983 to 1986. It's the newest edition of the Basic series of the D&D rules. It's named Beckme as it includes 5 separate sets: Basic, Expert, Companion, Masters, and Immortal. Basic and Expert would be further revised editions of the Molvay Basic and Expert rules. And I sectioned them off to the top of the chart there. And as you can see, other third-party companies were based on some of these rule sets, as you can see at the chart. Let's start our journey with the Holmes edition, BX D&D, Mentor D&D 1977. The lack of ability checks shaped how people originally played Dungeons and Dragons. Even so, characters tried things that the rules didn't cover. For many of these actions, success or failure hinged on the character's ability scores. Gary Gygax told Dungeon Masters to guess the odds of success and roll for it. But DMs and players wanted more consistency and less guessing. And that lends itself to the topic of why they invented 2nd edition and then 3rd edition D&D. Because over the years, it wasn't possible to learn how to play D&D or get into a group that didn't really know how to play either. And so you had subpar games. You had Dungeon Masters that really did not know what they're doing, and you ended up with a poor experience. And unfortunately, that was more than the norm as you go further west past the Mississippi, because because kids back then didn't get an opportunity to go to Gen Con to learn how to play the game. So they would try to buy the 1st edition. They would buy the box set book or the 1st edition AD&D book and try to figure out how to play the game. Unfortunately, the AD&D Dungeon Master Guide and Player's Handbook were not really written for players wanting to learn how to play the game from scratch. Gygax said in one of his interviews that he didn't really expect anybody to buy those books that didn't already know how to play the game. In fact, as you can see from the name of the books, Dungeon Master Guide, Player's Handbook, you're expected to already know how to play the game, and these were written to help you run the game. And TSR knew that at the time, that it was a problem, because they were getting letters in to Dragon Magazine and into the offices of players asking tons of questions about how to play the game. Sage's advice was the internet of those times. If you wanted to find out a ruling, you'd have to write a letter to Dragon Magazine or TSR and hopefully get a ruling sent back to you, or read it in the magazine. And that's the only way to settle arguments when it comes to arguing about the game. And you got to remember, a lot of these DMs were not the most experienced DMs how to run the game, so a lot of players would have some issues with that over the years. So TSR wanted to fix that. And one of the first thing they did was, when you created the D&D Basic box set, they actually wrote that in mind of teaching players how to play the game. And I remember when we were kids, we thought that box set was only for newbies, for beginners that didn't know how to play. And the advanced D&D was for players that already knew how to play, and they were advanced. They were playing more advanced D&D versus that box set stuff that was for kids. That was going through our heads at the time. I had no idea at the time that people were playing that till this day. This just blows my mind when I found that out about 5 years ago, that there's still people playing the box set till this day. And when I found out about Old School Essentials, that really got me turned on about the whole thing, and I got more into it, and I started realizing the benefits. So to continue, this video is about skill systems. So let's go ahead and analyze that from the very beginning. The first version of ability checks was found in 1976. Issue number 1, Dragon Magazine. How to Use Non-Prime Requisite Character Attributes by Wesley D. Ives. The article describes a new concept of ability checks before anyone even came up with a name for it, which requires 3 rolls and multiplication of double-digit numbers and a table. Really complicated, and many D&D players back in the day didn't really use that in their game, or they tried it once and gave up on it. Also, about that time, when Dungeons and Dragons came along, Arneson and Company continued to use the ability checks in their games. You can see an example of a dexterity check in Arneson's first fantasy campaign, 1977, where a character must save versus dexterity to remove their armor in time to avoid drowning in Blackmore Bay. And of course, ability checks are also very prominent in Arneson and Snyder's AIF game, 1978. Then, in Advanced Dungeons & Dragons Player's Handbook, 1978, Gary Gygax invented an ability check for the Dig spell. That's a 4th level wizard spell called Dig. It describes a score equal to or less than a dexterity, meaning that a fall was avoided. Since then, that method turned into a common house rule. To make an ability check, players must roll your attribute on a 20-sided die or less. And it's really interesting. A lot of games are kind of like that. Sometimes, like, you can't find a ruling for something, and you'll find it somewhere buried deep. Like, what happens if you're blind? Or what happens if you're stunned or prone? Sometimes some of these games omit that. And I don't want to point fingers at some of these games, but it is an issue sometimes. A lot of old school DMs don't really like skill systems, and I'm kind of like one of those. And I'm one of those people. And so having codified rulings goes against everything they stand for. How they run the game, how to make it flow fast. It's all about pace and timing, how to make that game fun. The more you codify the rules, the slower the game, it slows the game down, and it actually restricts player creativity. To continue on, in 1980, D&D Basic Rules by Tom Molvay made this house rule official. And quote, "The DM may want to base a character's chance of doing something on his or her ability scores, strength, dexterity, and so forth. To perform a difficult task, such like climbing a rope or thinking of a forgotten clue, the player should roll the ability score or less on a d20. The DM may give a bonus or a penalty to the roll depending on the difficulty of the action." Unfortunately, there was no chart for that, so the Dungeon Master had to come up with that bonus or penalty on their own. There was no guide to go by. Following that, in 1977, it's the secondary skills table in the Dungeon Master Guide. And then in second edition, it's called non-weapon proficiencies. And then 3E and 4E added a true skill system. The game calls for you to roll those skills all the time. 4E adds a skill challenge system for handling non-combat obstacles that required effort over an extended duration. Let's continue along the timeline from AD&D First Edition. Gygax then wrote Unearthed Arcana in 1985, which added weapon proficiencies as a sort of a weapon skill, but the narrow scope kept the sharp lines between classes. Then, in 1985, he also released Oriental Adventures, extended the concept of the create non-weapon proficiencies skills without the name. These new proficiencies never overlapped with the class abilities. Finally, in 1986, the Dungeoneers Survival Guide was released. Here, the non-weapon proficiencies from Oriental Adventures became options in the primary game. When players used non-weapon proficiencies, they made proficiency checks to determine the outcome. These checks operated like ability checks, but proficiency improved the chance of success. You got to remember, these books came out before AD&D Second Edition. And in Second Edition, they had to revamp it to make it more playable. But also, there was Dragon Magazine articles at the time too. So you got to remember, if you're playing AD&D First Edition since 1978, you've been playing D&D for 10 years. You've been playing D&D. And then when these skill systems came out from Oriental Adventures or the Unearthed Arcana or the Dungeoneers Survival Guide, that was really exciting at the time. These were rules that we all really needed. Especially the DMs that didn't have a lot of experience adjudicating things. And you had players that pushed back a lot because the Dungeon Master was standing on shaky ground. And the players, they wanted it to be codified, they wanted it to be consistent, and they wanted it to be fair. So when these rules came out, that was a godsend to a lot of us. We were really excited about that. But for the DMs that were still playing basic for like 10, 15 years, and they learned how to play from the very beginning, they didn't really need that help, or they didn't think they did. Not all DMs are the same. Some DMs think that the way they run the game is the optimal way to run the game. It's the way they like to run the game. It's what they think is exciting and cool. But not all DMs are the same. Some DMs, if you sit at two different tables of DMs, like at a convention or anywhere, they're gonna present that game in a completely different way. It's their own personality, what they focus on, their skill sets. Some are better public speakers, some are better at personal communication and describing and narration, or some are more organized, others are not. Some are good at improvisation. So they all have different skill sets, and it doesn't make one DM better than the other. But it really depends on if the player likes that DM or not, if he likes the kind of game he's running. So those DMs, that are still playing basic D&D, they didn't feel like they needed any skill system. But I see why they came out with it, because there's a lot of DMs out there that needed it for their group, for their table. And so you got to remember also, TSR was battling this issue where there was hundreds and thousands of players buying this game, and they had no idea how to play the game. And they were trying to read these books, trying to figure it out. And of course, you're going to get a lot of it wrong. Just try reading those books. I mean, they're really difficult to comprehend and understand, especially if you've never played D&D before. You have no idea what some of these concepts that Guy Gax was alluding to. Now we get to AD&D 2nd edition in 1989. Still, basically, it's AD&D 1st edition, but the rules have been reorganized and rewritten for clarity. In 2nd edition, the skill system was called non-weapon proficiencies. A little bit of history about that. The way they presented the non-weapon proficiencies in the previous books and in Dragon Magazine was really confusing, and a lot of players didn't get it. It was just a lot of inconsistency the way they described how to use those rules, and it caused a lot of problems. And TSR finally admitted that publicly in Dragon Magazine. They went ahead and revamped it for 2nd edition. They rewrote it. So this is how non-weapon proficiencies work. Based on how you look at it from 2nd edition perspective. If the roll is equal to or less than the character's adjusted ability score, the character accomplished what he was trying to do. If the roll is greater than the character's ability score, the character fails at the task. A roll of 20 always fails. The DM determines what effects, if any, accompany the failure. Of course, to use a proficiency, the character must have any tools or materials needed to do the job. Then you add or subtract any modifications the DM assigns based on the conditions at that time. The DM assigns based on the conditions at that time. You know, it's really funny is that last bit is always glossed over in many rule systems, or a lot of DMs don't read it. They just didn't. I just pointed it out just today about Old School Essentials. That's stated in the book, but a lot of DMs kind of skip past it. It's like a little tiny paragraph that a Dungeon Master can assign anywhere from -4 to +4 bonus or penalty to any ability check. And most systems have that rule. You just gotta use it and find it. And I think it's really critical for role playing. I really do. Because the player can control his destiny. He can affect the outcome of anything he tries to do by between the way he role plays, the way he presents himself, what he looks like, his race, his class, any special equipment he might have, or any creative use or thinking outside the box. You can actually position yourself to get a bonus for something that's really hard to do, make it easier. That's the concept behind that, anyway. Okay, so. At this point, I want to point out a few problems with non-weapon proficiencies. So, 1, class abilities already covered most of the character's actions. So, non-weapon proficiencies rarely came up in play. I personally saw that when I was running my games back in the day. 2, the phrase non-weapon proficiency, it's kind of unwieldy to say that, to use those words. The term evolved from Gary's own work on D&D. But it forced a lot of extra syllables on players just to avoid contaminating D&D with anything called skills, the word skills. You know, that plus rolling under, that plus rolling under, and THACO, and it, you know, if you get used to it, you get used to it, and you can play the game, and we did. But a lot of new players were really frustrated. Heck, I had players that's been playing for years, and they still get it wrong. They still can't figure out the THACO. And things like this just adds to it. And it's kind of a good thing in some of the OSR products or the newer versions that they kind of smooth that out to make it more playable, easier, accessible. Okay, 3. Roll under ability checks confused players and the designers. Normally, to succeed in anything, you must have to roll high, but for ability checks, you had to roll low. This caused a lot of confusion. The original ability check rule stated, quote, "The DM may give a bonus or a penalty to the roll depending on the difficulty of the action," unquote. That meant a bonus subtracted from the roll. New and experienced players were often confused and delayed the fast pace of the game. And I've seen that personally myself as well. Finally, on top of all that, the Sage Advice column in Dragon Magazine, issue number 118, tried to sort out the mess. And then they finally said, quote, okay, already. You're right. There is something wrong with the DSG non-weapon proficiency system. We went through the manuscript and thought we had caught all the places where the text needed to be changed. We missed a couple of simple ones, and this caused a tremendous problem in the system." Unquote. So there's your proof right there. So it came down to where the second edition Player's Handbook in 1989 included a corrected version of the non-weapon proficiencies as an optional rule. And then we come across third edition D&D in the year 2000. The first edition created by Wizards of the Coast. Third edition took the idea from the AD&D second edition Skills and Powers book and developed a cleaner system for customizing characters by designing the classes so a level of one class can stack on top of another class. A single level chart was introduced, and each level a character would take a new class or add another level of the class that they already had. And I don't see how that's not more confusing. I remember learning third edition and then trying to run a couple campaigns with it, and I wasn't having too much fun with it. D&D third edition in 2000 was redesigned from ground up, in which the DM became the judge or the referee, and the players were empowered with all the roles. The designers finally gained leeway to correct all drawbacks. Ability checks flipped, so players aimed for high rolls. Skills embraced the actions that characters actually did in the game, and I'm all for that part, yes. That's one of the things that D&D 3.0 did to really improve the game, was make sure that everything was forward rolling. Like, totally on board with that. I completely agree. Don't agree with anything else that they did in the design stages of that game, but that's one thing I thought that really improved the game. And that's one of the reasons why I like newer games like AD&D 3rd Edition, which is Castles and Crusades. Everything's forward rolling, forward facing. And also another game I play is Oldschool Essentials. They give you that option to use THAC0 or forward rolling. And of course, when I run that game, I use the forward rolling option because I find it a lot faster to run at the table, and it doesn't confuse my players. So also 3rd edition, in addition to feats that were added to allow characters to further customize their abilities, a true skill system was introduced and integrated into the game. The underlying D20 system worked by rolling equal to or higher than the target number and adding various bonus. This was used across the game in a standard way. Problems developed at higher levels as the number of options increased to the point where players had a tough time resolving their actions. The game calls for you to roll these skills all the time, and I personally saw that too. That game is absolutely unwieldy past 5th level. You just can't run a fun game unless you're really into slow games. I personally witnessed a melee round take 1 hour. It was insane. It was just too much. For the kind of game I like to run, I just couldn't handle it, and I had to stop running that version. And I took a hiatus from D&D for a long time. And I think a lot of people did too, because, all those MMOs came out, like EverQuest and WoW and all those games. And I remember back before 3rd edition came out, D&D was on a decline, and less people were playing it. And a lot of people stepped away from the hobby in the late 90s. And then when 3rd edition came out, a lot of people came back. And one more thing I wanted to point out. Dungeons & Dragons is a role-based game. It is not a skill-based game. And what they did with 3rd edition and forward, they turned it into a skill-based game. My stance is, if you're going to play a skill-based game, play a skill-based game. There's a lot of games out there like that, like GURPS, for example. If you like that kind of game, play that game. Why change our game? Why change Dungeons & Dragons to something that's not supposed to be? And so that's what happened starting in 3rd edition. It became a skill-based game. So in 4th edition in 2008, this edition is a completely new game with all new game mechanics and carried over from the 3rd edition. It was a simple set of core rules that defines all characters and monster abilities as exceptions, which are described in standard terms. I don't have a lot of comments on that game. I tried it once, didn't care for it, and I didn't play it again. I took another hiatus for a while until 5th edition came out. In 2014, Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition was released. This is the current edition of D&D. Unlike D&D 4th edition, this edition draws on some, but not much, of the mechanics introduced in classic D&D, OD&D, AD&D 2nd edition, and D&D 3rd edition. The official stance on that is they drew a lot from those editions. But I think that's propaganda and marketing. I think they drew some, because the game is way too different from those versions to be but you draw a lot from them. I played that game personally in 4 different campaigns, and I ran another one after that. I just gotta say that it is an absolutely different game. It's not Dungeons and Dragons 1st, 2nd, or 3rd edition at all. It's a totally new game. It's a totally new game that they called Dungeons and Dragons. Skill systems stymies creativity. The use of skill lists is a shackle of sorts, funneling the many things a player can do into these skills. If what they want to do is something that is not on this form of illusion of choice, then they just can't do it. But it's more than just that. It's the whole idea behind it. When a player, especially a new player, is trying to role play a game, he's trying to figure a way out of the problem, the situation. And he's looking down at his character sheet and he sees a list of skills on his character sheet. So he assumes in his head that he thinks that's all I can do. And if none of those skills on his character sheet will meet to seem not to be of any use to the situation he's in, then he is gonna feel like he can't do anything, that there's nothing that his character can do. Then he'll ask another character at the table, is there anything you can do? What skills do you have? There's a lot of things about these rules that people don't fully read or comprehend, and one of those things started with non-weapon proficiencies in 2nd edition. It's stated in there that the characters that were proficient in something means they're good at that. That doesn't mean other people can't do it. It just means that that person is good at doing that. He's just really good at it. It doesn't mean that he can't do other things. But of course, new players, don't see past that. If you didn't have that list in the first place, the new player would have to be he'll have to think outside the box. You'll have to be creative. You'll have to think of ways to get out of it. In fact, if you ever try running a game for like a bunch of kids under 10 or 12 years old, they have these creative minds and they can think of all sorts of things. They're a lot of fun to role play with because they can do things that are more daring and fun than an actual adult group that hems and haws all night long and never gets anything done or gets anywhere. I've seen that firsthand before. The idea is these skill systems are really good for new players, yes, because they're new to the game, especially if they're not very creative and have a high imagination. That list will give them ideas of some of the things they can do. But I find it's detrimental to the game. If they didn't have that list in the first place, the Dungeon Master could suggest a few things to help them out, give them some ideas of what they could try to do, but also encourage them to think of something else. I've had some wonderfully creative players before in my games that thought of stuff I never even dreamed of thinking about. It was really fun to play with them, and they didn't have a skill list. What I'm talking about, though, is completely different from backgrounds. What you did being raised by your parents in the past before you became an adventurer. That's something totally different. I'm just talking about skills as an adventurer. Let me show you some of these non-weapon proficiencies that I was talking about with 1st edition AD&D. This list is some of the things that somebody can level up in. Basically, you spend a slot to become proficient in one of these skills. The more slots you devote to a skill, your die roll modifier goes up. And also, as you level up too, you get more slots to spend. And basically, you look up a skill like Animal Trainer, and it's going to be a Wisdom check. And then the die modifier will be 0. Some of these die modifiers represent how hard or easier certain skills are. Some are very difficult, like a boat right. It's a -2 in your die roll to perform that proficiency because it's a really difficult vocation, I suppose. Charioting, direction sense. But it's really easy for fungus identification for some reason. They give you a +6. Remember, with non-weapon proficiencies, you have to roll your ability score or less. And so these die roll modifiers affect it depending on how hard the proficiency is. Dungeoneers Survival Guide and the Wilderness Survival Guide are all listed right here. But on this list, the non-weapon proficiencies from Oriental Adventures are not included because they use a base chance of success instead of ability score based. It's a different system. A few things to point out about this chart. The first chart on the top left is for AD&D First Edition Oriental Adventures, and I combined it with Second Edition. That chart right there, those modifiers are from those two sources there. So a DM would make a ruling of how easy or hard something is that the player is trying to do. Like they're trying to pick a pocket in a merchant in a busy marketplace. You gotta ask yourself, is that very hard to do, or is that easy to do? Or is it just a normal thing? Castles and Crusades is a little different. They have a challenge rating system, you have to add that number to the number they have to roll. So if they need a 12 or higher to succeed at something and they're trying to do a difficult task, it could be a 22 or higher if you assign a 10 to that task. AD&D second edition non-weapon proficiencies, as I explained before, you have to roll under the ability score with a d20. You add or subtract your ability modifier, your attribute modifier. Roll 20 always fails. And the Dungeon Master can assign a difficulty rating. And that could be that chart on the left top. It could be that chart from the top left under Oriental Adventures in 2E. So very easy could be +3 and extremely hard could be -3. And then, of course, you should have, in any system, the right tools and material requirement. And then, of course, there's the proficiency bonus. Like I said before, the proficiency bonus is how many slots you paid in that proficiency to increase your bonus. Another interesting thing about this chart in the bottom left-hand corner is the comparison between Dungeons & Dragons 3.5 and 5e. As you can see, the spread is quite different. 3.5 starts at 0 and goes all the way up to 40. But 5e starts at 5 and goes to 30. And it's interesting that C&C starts at 1 and goes to 25. So if you compare I've seen a lot of people on the forums, ask about converting like 3rd edition modules into 5th edition, and they ask if the DCs are compatible. And as you can see from this chart, they are not. That you have to do some math, and then it's not simple math either. It's not just subtract 10, because as you can see, the spread is higher. The spread is wider at 3.5. So the lower numbers, 0 and 5, go lower than the lower numbers of 5e. And the higher numbers, like 30 and 40, go higher than 5e. So the spread is lots more, it's going in both directions. So it's not a matter of just subtracting 5 or 10. You actually have to modify it all across the board. Because if you look at very easy for 3.5, it is no modifier, it's a 0. But in 5th edition, it's a 5. And if you look at the average of 3.5 is 10, but the moderate in 5e is a 15. Then it gets really high after that with 3.5, all the way up to 40. So as you can see, it's not a simple conversion. Then finally, in the bottom right-hand corner, next to one of my orcs, is a various popular skill checks that was reported to be used over the years. Most of these come from playing basic or expert. Most of these come from playing basic or expert D&D, because those systems really don't have a skill system, and people have to figure out if you're going to try to perform something, some action, you got to adjudicate that somehow. And it's always been a DM fiat to be able to figure that out. You just make a ruling. Well, like, not all DMs are equal, and not all of them are going to think outside the box or be Johnny on the spot, coming up with a number right away without being the same number all the time. And so sometimes it's nice to have a little bit of help. And so some of these rulings right here help. Like some DMs, they'll just roll 3 dice 6. You just got to roll your attribute score or less, and you succeed. Others, like to hit type rolls, the second line item, the Dungeon Master will choose an AC for the target. Like you're trying to shoot with an arrow that bottle out of that bandit's hand. So I'd give that an AC of 3, which would be like an AC 17 forward roll. And if they're trying to hit a wall or trying to hit something really big, I'd give them armor class 10. Then the next line item down is percentage. It's a simple matter of taking their attribute, times that by 5, and that's your percentage you have to roll. So if you have like I can't do math. If you have a 10 intelligence, that would be 50% or less on a percentage dice. DM ruling. So some will just make a simple ruling. This is what a lot of old DMs do on the fly. They've been doing it forever. They're really good at it. And they'll say, just roll dice 6. 2 in 6 chance. That's your chance. That's your chance of jumping across that pit. 2 in 6. Go ahead, and sometimes they might add something like dexterity modifier or something, give you a +1. Or another way to do it is D20 and add your attribute bonus to that too. Another way is from AD in 1st edition on Dungeon Master Guide, page 11. It's called the secondary skill system. That was before non-weapon proficiencies came around, but there was no codification of those rules at all. It just talked about it, and it sounded cool, but it didn't actually have any charts or rules for it, so it was very hard to adjudicate. And then, of course, another way to do this, which is a lot of basic D&D does, is they use savings throws. So basically, you pick a savings throw on a savings throw chart that looks fairly close, like breath weapon. If I was to dodge something, I'd use breath weapon. So that's a good example right there. Dodge something like a swinging axe or something, I'd make a savings throw versus breath weapon. So that's how a lot of old D&D was run, by just using the savings throws. But the problem with these systems is you don't get better over time as you level up. You just don't. Castles of Crusades handles that eloquently. You just add your level to your roll. So at 5th level, you get +5 to your roll. But your DC, your challenge level would be the monster's hit dice or the other player's hit dice. Or that chart right there. Is it easy, difficult, very hard, or heroic? So you have to use those. And that's how you would handle that. So they all have different ways. And also, Castles of Crusades uses attribute scores for their savings throws. It's all combined into one mechanic, which is really cool. And it's really fast and really fun to play. There's a few more ways that's not on this chart. I mentioned roll 3d6 to get your attribute score or less. Some DMs will let you roll 2d6 if it's really difficult. Or if it's a very particularly challenging task, it's a 4d6, 5d6 for a nigh impossible task. That's one way a lot of DMs handle that sort of thing. Another one is they'll hand wave it. So if something isn't critical to the storyline or something very entertaining, like trying to avoid a fall damage, you would simply decide for yourself what the chances are of accomplishing the task, and then you roll a percentage dice. Actually, some DMs in the past would actually roll for the player. Another way that a lot of DMs from the past would handle it is if it's something critical or something entertaining, you can simply rule success to say, okay, you do it. In fact, some of these systems say there's a statement. The statement goes, you only roll if there's a critical chance of failure. I think even 5th edition talks about that. You don't always have to roll for something. If it's something that's not going to be story changing, if it's not going to be critical to the campaign story or mission, why even roll it? You're just wasting time if it's something really simple. Basically, it just comes down to the style and whatever particular value common sense happens to be. It's also possible to entertain suggestions from the players as to what they think their chances might be and make up your mind from there. With 1st edition, there's a lot of seat of the pants judgment calls. And the idea is to both keep the game flowing and to encourage creative thinking on the part of the players without simply giving them everything. This is one thing very different from later iterations of D&D, which started to incorporate a greater number of rules to cover such things. So that wraps up the new chart I created for skill systems and different versions of D&D. Basically, the focus of this video is to see that chart. I was just talking around it. I'm hoping. I know a lot of this was redundant, just a brief history of D&D and where it came from and why and some of the reasons. Maybe what I talked to enlightened a few people about the subject and find it interesting and fascinating. If you like what you saw here and you found this video helpful, please click like below so I'll spread to more people. That way you can follow the channel and encourage me to make more of these videos. Please comment below of anything you thought that should be changed about the chart that I put up, or maybe you can add some tidbits and information that I didn't cover that was important to the timeline and the growth of skill systems in D&D.
Did you enjoy video? Consider tossing support on my Patreon. It best way to support orcs. If you would like to see more content, subscribe and post comments below. It better not be bad.
Thank you for watching, and please subscribe and continue playing Dungeons & Dragons.